Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about loops. Loops have a technical name in programming, which is iteration. Now, iteration, along with two other concepts, sequence and selection, make up the three fundamental programming constructs. So iteration is basically loops, which you're going to see today. Sequence, we've already used. So sequence just means step-by-step instructions, just an ordered set of instructions. Selection are if statements. So you may have seen an if statement before. It's basically a decision point. So if such and such, then do such and such. And there's also if-else statements and switch statements as well. So we're going to talk about selection later. Today we're going to focus on iteration. Well, actually there's several types of loops in Flash. There is the while loop. There is the do while loop, which is just a variation on the while loop. And there's the for loop. They're the three main loops. There are a few others, but we'll cover those later when we talk about arrays. First loop we're going to have a look at is the while loop. And I've got one here. So I created this class earlier and called it loops. And I associated the loops AS file with my loops Flash file, my FLA file. So let's have a look at the while loop. So the very first thing I'm doing here is I'm setting up what they call a counter variable. So when you're working with loops, you often want to loop or repeat yourself a certain number of times. So in programming there's a special term for that sort of variable which keeps track of how many times you've repeated yourself or how many times you've looped, and that's called a counter variable. The counter variable can be sometimes called counter, just the actual word counter, or count, or a few other variations of that. However, probably the most common name for a counter variable is just the letter I. So here I've got var I. So I've declared this I, my counter variable, as an integer. So an integer, we've looked at integer variables in a past video. So an integer is basically a positive or negative whole number. So I'm just using a simple loop to begin with. So an integer variable is fine. So my counter variable, I've set my counter variable to 0. We're going to start at 0. You may think that we'd be better off starting at 1, but that's quite uncommon in programming to start at 1. We usually start at 0. So next line, we've got var num, also an integer variable, and we've set that to 5. So our loop is going to loop 5 times. However, we have to look at our loop in further detail to see exactly what's going on. So this is the while loop. So we've got the keyword while, and actually you may want to add some space in your while loop. Let's add a bit more space so we can see the while loop a bit better. So I've added a bit of space there. You can add white space in most places in ActionScript. It usually makes no difference to the actual program, but may aid readability. I tend to not put too much white space in, but I do like to separate out code using white space when there's a complex bit of code. Okay, so we've got the while loop. So while, and you just take the English meaning of the word while, or you could say until. So while, until, but we'll say while. While I, which is our counter variable, set to 0, this is the smaller than or less than symbol. So while I is less than num, which we set to 5, we're going to do something. And the something is between these two braces. And we're simply going to trace out, our trace function should be familiar now. We're simply going to trace out the value of I, which is our counter variable. So I is keeping track of how many times our loop has run. Now the third line here, we say this is I++. This is what we call an increment. Oops. So the double plus plus is our increment. Basically, it means we're increasing the value of I by 1. So this could be written as I equals I plus 1. So you could put that in and it would do exactly the same thing. However, this is a shorthand syntax, which is a lot more common. So our loop, going through it again, we're going to, while I is less than 5, we're simply going to trace out the value of I and increase I by 1. Now you might be wondering, how many times is this going to run? Think 5? Well, that is correct. But do we understand why it's going to run just 5 times? It's only running 5 times rather than 6 because I is initially set to 0. And we're saying while I is less than 5, we're going to do the trace statement. So as soon as I increases and becomes 5, we're going to exit the loop. Because at this stage, once I is increased to the value 5, it will attempt to loop again. It will come to this while statement and see that I less than 5 is not true. I is not less than 5. It's because it's been increased to 5. It's equal to 5. At this point, we need to exit. So we exit. Now let's run the program and see what result we get. Okay, so as you can see, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Exactly what we expected.